I'm Holden, 32 years old, and never in my wildest dreams did I imagine buying my first home would land me in court facing my own parents. There's something surreal about seeing the people who raised you sitting on the opposite side of a courtroom, anger in their eyes. 10 years of working non-stop, living on ramen noodles, saving every penny, all for this moment. When that certified letter arrived, just weeks after I closed on my house, I couldn't believe what I was reading. Before I tell you how my own parents dragged me to court, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had family try to control your life decisions. Growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in Michigan wasn't particularly remarkable on the surface. Our house was modest but comfortable, the kind of place where neighborhood kids would gather to ride bikes or play street hockey. From the outside, we probably looked like the perfect American family: mom, dad, a son, and a daughter. But inside those walls was a different story entirely. My parents, Martha and Robert, had a thing about control, especially when it came to money and possessions. Looking back now, I can see how abnormal it was, but as a kid I thought every family operated this way. One of my earliest memories was being 4 years old and having my mom explain that the new toy truck my grandparents had given me for Christmas didn't actually belong to me. "It belongs to the family, Holden," she said, firmly placing it on a shelf. "We all share everything here." That became the mantra of my childhood. Nothing was ever truly mine. Birthday gifts, Christmas presents, even the clothes on my back were considered family property. My sister Natalie and I weren't allowed to keep anything in our rooms that our parents couldn't inspect or take away at any moment. I remember clearly the devastation of my 10th birthday. My grandparents had given me a brand new Game Boy, the thing I'd been dreaming about for months. I was ecstatic already, planning which games I would save up for. 3 days later, I came home from school to find it gone. Mom had returned it to the store because it was too extravagant. When I started crying, my father sat me down for a lecture about materialism and family priorities. "We make decisions as a family, son. Individual wants don't come before family needs." By middle school, I had learned not to get attached to anything. What was the point? Even the model airplanes I painstakingly built would be moved to the family room because everyone should enjoy them. My allowance was another exercise in control. Unlike my friends who received $5 or $10 to spend however they wanted, my allowance came with spreadsheets. Dad would sit me down every Sunday evening to divide my $7 50%. Went directly to a savings account. I couldn't access 40% to a so-called college fund, and only 10%, a measly 70 cents, was mine to spend frivolously, as my father called it. My sister Natalie, 2 years older than me, rebelled against this system much earlier than I did. By her senior year of high school, she was in constant conflict with our parents. The day after her graduation, she announced she'd accepted a scholarship to a college in California, 3,000 miles away. I still remember the tense silence at the dinner table, my father's face turning that particular shade of purple that meant trouble. "You didn't consult with the family about this decision," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's my life," Natalie responded, looking him directly in the eye. She left 2 weeks later and rarely came back. For years, she was the family cautionary tale, the daughter who abandoned her responsibilities. Now I understand she was just the first to break free. When I turned 16 and got my first real job bagging groceries at the local supermarket, I was so proud to receive my first paycheck. That pride quickly evaporated when my parents insisted I hand over 80% of it for safekeeping. They created what they called a family investment fund that supposedly would benefit all of us eventually. Whenever I asked for details about this fund, the conversations would turn circular, with vague references to future security and teaching financial responsibility. My high school years passed with this same pattern, working various part-time jobs, surrendering most of my earnings, and being made to feel selfish whenever I wanted to make a purchase. Meanwhile, my parents had access to my bank account and monitored every transaction. A $10 movie ticket would trigger an interrogation about wasteful spending. When college acceptance letters arrived, my dreams of going to State University with my best friend Marcus were quickly crushed. Despite receiving a partial scholarship, my parents insisted I attend the local community college and live at home to save money. The fact that living in the dorms might actually have been cheaper with my scholarship was irrelevant. The real currency was control, not dollars. Those 4 years of college were a strange limbo. I was technically an adult driving to classes and working part-time, yet still living under my parents' financial microscope. They insisted on seeing my grades immediately after they were posted. If I earned anything less than an A, I would be lectured about wasting the family's educational investment. After graduation, when my friends were moving to apartments in the city, or even buying starter homes with their new salaries, my parents had already planned my next steps. "You'll live here while you establish your career," Mom announced as if it had already been decided. No sense throwing money away on rent when you can save for the future. What future, I wondered? The future they'd mapped out for me, or the one I might want for myself? When I brought home my first real paycheck from my entry-level marketing position, my father was waiting with a spreadsheet and a proposal for how I should contribute to the household, a contribution that amounted to roughly 60% of my income, but somehow didn't grant me any additional autonomy. This pattern continued for years. Any time I mentioned moving out, I was made to feel financially irresponsible. When I needed a car for my commute, they insisted on co-signing the loan despite my credit being perfectly fine, giving them another thread of control. They steered me away from bank loans toward family loans with terms they dictated. Every financial decision became a family discussion, or more accurately, a family directive. By 25, I had a creeping realization that something wasn't right, but extracting myself seemed impossible. The roots of control ran too deep. The tipping point came shortly after my 25th birthday. I'd received a promotion at work, and with it a substantial raise. For the first time, I could envision actual independence. I found a small one-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes from my parents' house. Not as far as I'd like, but a start. When I announced my plan to move out, you'd think I'd declared I was joining a cult, Mom cried. Dad paced. Both insisted I was making a catastrophic financial mistake. "Rent is throwing money away," Dad said for the 100th time. "At least wait until you can buy something." "I might be 35 before I can afford to buy something," I replied, finally finding my voice. "Exactly," he said, missing my point entirely. "That's why you need to stay here and save." Despite their protests, I signed the lease. The day I moved out was tense, but liberating. Mom kept finding reasons to put things back in my car to keep for me. Dad insisted on reviewing my lease agreement one more time, pointing out all the ways he thought I was being taken advantage of. Freedom, I quickly discovered, wasn't as simple as changing my address. My parents still had their hooks in deep. They had access to my bank accounts they'd opened for me as a child and remained linked to. They still received my mail, including financial statements, and felt entitled to open and review them before passing them along. When I mentioned getting a credit card to build credit history, my father lectured me about debt for an hour, then suggested a family loan instead, with terms that would essentially keep me beholden to them indefinitely. 3 months into living on my own, I met with a financial advisor named James, who looked increasingly concerned as I explained my situation. "Holden," he said finally, "what you're describing isn't normal parental guidance. These are controlling behaviors that are preventing you from establishing financial independence." That meeting was eye-opening. James helped me create a plan, open new bank accounts at a different bank, redirect my direct deposit, establish credit in my name alone, and most importantly, set clear boundaries with my parents about financial information. Executing this plan was harder than I'd anticipated. When I opened new accounts and stopped depositing money into the ones my parents could access, they showed up at my apartment unannounced, demanding explanations. When I changed my mailing address for all financial communications, they called, repeatedly concerned that I was hiding things from them. Every boundary I established was met with emotional manipulation. After all, "We've done for you" became my mother's refrain. "This is how you repay us." 6 months into my independence journey, I got another promotion at work but decided not to tell my parents. The additional income went straight into a savings account they knew nothing about. For the first time, I was saving for myself, not for the nebulous family fund. My best friend Marcus was instrumental during this period. Having known my family dynamics since childhood, he provided much-needed perspective. "Dude," he said one evening over beers at my apartment, "you know this isn't how most parents act, right? My mom asks if I'm saving enough for retirement, but she doesn't demand bank statements. Those conversations helped normalize what healthy financial independence should look like. I began setting a goal that had seemed impossible before homeownership completely on my own terms. For the next several years, I lived frugally and worked tirelessly. I took on freelance marketing projects on weekends. I worked overtime whenever it was offered. I lived on ramen noodles and frozen vegetables more often than I'd like to admit. Every extra dollar went into my secret savings account. During this period, I limited contact with my parents to occasional dinners, where I deflected questions about my finances. Our relationship became superficial but less contentious. They seemed to believe I was going through a phase, and would eventually return to the fold. In the midst of establishing my independence, I reconnected with my childhood friend Brendan, who had gone through similar experiences with his controlling mother. "It's like coming out of a fog," he told me over coffee. "You don't realize how thick it is until you're finally seeing clearly." Those words resonated deeply. Each month of financial independence brought more clarity about just how abnormal my upbringing had been. Therapy also became an important part of my journey. My therapist, Dr. Collins, helped me understand the deep-rooted anxiety I felt around money and possessions, how I'd been conditioned to feel guilty for wanting anything for myself. "You're not breaking the family by becoming independent," he assured me during one session. "You're actually establishing healthier patterns for your future." By the time I turned 30, I had saved enough for a modest down payment. The housing market in our area was competitive but not impossible for a first-time buyer. I began researching neighborhoods, mortgage rates, and the home buying process, all without breathing a word to my parents. The path to independence wasn't linear. There were moments of doubt times when the familiar pull of family expectations made me question whether I was being selfish. But with each passing month of making my own decisions, paying my own bills, and saving money that was truly mine, I grew more confident in my right to an autonomous adult life. The journey taught me that independence isn't just about physical distance or separate bank accounts. It's about reclaiming your own agency, your right to make decisions without justifying them to others. By 32, I felt ready to take the biggest step, yet buying my own home with my name alone on the deed. House hunting began on a crisp Saturday morning in October. I'd connected with Diana, a real estate agent, recommended by a colleague. She was refreshingly straightforward, asking what I was looking for without any of the judgment I'd grown accustomed to from my parents. "I want something modest, but mine," I told her. 2 bedrooms, maybe a small yard. Nothing flashy, just solid. Diana nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. We spent weekends visiting properties throughout the winter and into spring. The market was challenging. Homes in my price range were either in need of significant repairs or snapped up within days of listing, often with cash offers well above asking price. My first offer was on a small ranch-style house with good bones but outdated everything. I bid $5,000 above asking, stretching my budget to the limit, only to learn it sold for $20,000 more to someone who waived the inspection. My second offer met a similar fate. "Don't get discouraged," Diana advised. "The right house will come along. This is a marathon, not a sprint." She was right, but after 5 rejected offers, the marathon was wearing me down. Each lost house felt like another delay in claiming my independence. Then, on a Tuesday evening in April, Diana called with excitement in her voice. "New listing just hit the system. It's not even on the public sites yet. We need to see it tomorrow morning." The house was a modest 2-bedroom Cape Cod on a quiet street. Built in the 1970s, it had been owned by an elderly couple who had maintained it meticulously. The kitchen and bathrooms needed updating, but the roof was new, the systems were sound, and there was a small fenced backyard with a mature maple tree. Best of all, it was listed slightly below what similar homes had sold for recently. "This is it," I whispered to Diana, as we stood in the living room with its large windows and original hardwood floors. I could already picture my life here, away from scrutiny and control. We submitted an offer that evening, $10,000 above, asking with an escalation clause a letter to the sellers about why I loved their home and as few contingencies as I dared. Then came 24 hours of nail-biting anxiety. The call from Diana came as I was leaving work the next day. They accepted, They had multiple offers but chose yours because they loved your letter. They wanted their home to go to someone who would care for it. The mortgage process was next, and I approached it with trepidation. Despite years of careful credit building, I feared something would derail the process, perhaps some hidden family financial entanglement I'd forgotten to sever. The mortgage broker asked endless questions about income, assets, and debt. Each time he nodded with satisfaction at my answers, I felt a surge of validation. My financial history, built deliberately and independently, was strong enough to stand on its own. The day of my pre-approval letter was perhaps more emotional than finding the house itself. There it was in black and white. Holden was qualified to purchase this home based solely on my own credit, income, and savings. No cosigners, no family loans, no parental oversight, just me. Throughout this process, I maintained absolute secrecy. My parents still didn't know I was looking to buy a house. Marcus knew, of course, as did a few trusted colleagues, but I was terrified that if my parents found out, they would find some way to interfere, insist on co-signing, demand input on the location or features, or worst of all, claim some ownership based on their delusional family fund concept. The weeks leading to closing were a blur of inspections, paperwork, and anxiety. Each time my phone rang, I feared it was my parents somehow discovering my plans. Each document I signed felt like another step toward true freedom. Closing day arrived in late May. Sitting at that long table signing paper after paper, I kept expecting something to go wrong, for the attorney to say there was a problem, for my parents to burst through the door, for the whole dream to evaporate. But none of that happened. Instead, the seller's attorney slid a set of keys across the table. "Congratulations, homeowner," she said with a warm smile. I sat in my car afterward, keys in hand, and wept. They were tears of relief, of accomplishment, of finally breaking free from the patterns that had constrained me for so long. Moving day was a celebration. Marcus arrived early with coffee and donuts. My colleagues Rachel and Sam came with their pickup trucks. By sunset, my modest possessions were arranged in my very own house. We ordered pizza and sat on the floor of my living room toasting with beer because I hadn't unpacked the glasses yet. To Holden, Marcus raised his bottle. Who did this completely on his own terms. That first night alone in the house was surreal. The unfamiliar creaks and sounds kept me awake, but not unpleasantly so. This was my roof, my walls, my future. I walked through each room at midnight, touching door frames and windowsills, still hardly believing they belonged to me. The next few weeks were filled with small projects: painting the living room, replacing cabinet hardware in the kitchen, fixing a loose banister on the stairs. Each repair, no matter how minor, filled me with satisfaction. No one could tell me which color to choose or criticize my handiwork. The decisions were mine alone. My neighbors, the Johnsons, stopped by with a homemade pie and welcome card. Other neighbors waved from their yards or introduced themselves when I was mowing the lawn. This sense of community, freely chosen rather than imposed, was another unexpected joy of homeownership. After 2 weeks of settling in, I decided it was time to tell my parents. Despite everything, I wanted them to be part of this milestone. Perhaps naively, I hoped they would be proud of what I'd accomplished. I invited them for dinner the following Sunday, not mentioning it was at my new house rather than my apartment. I spent that Sunday cleaning obsessively and preparing my mother's favorite lasagna recipe. I set the table with new dishes, arranged fresh flowers from my garden, and tried to calm the anxiety churning in my stomach. At 5 o'clock, I texted them the address, simply saying, "I have a surprise. Come to this address instead of the apartment." At 5:30, their car pulled into the driveway. I watched from the window as they looked at the house in confusion, checking the address again. Then I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. "Welcome to my home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my pounding heart. "I bought a house." The silence that followed my announcement seemed to stretch for an eternity. My parents stood frozen on the walkway, staring at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Mom's expression shifted from confusion to shock, while Dad's face immediately darkened. "What do you mean, your house?" Dad finally asked, his voice eerily calm. "I mean, I bought it. It's mine," I replied, gesturing for them to come inside. "I want to show you around." They followed me through the front door with the hesitant steps of people entering unknown territory. As I led them through the living room dining area and into the kitchen where dinner was warming, neither spoke a word. They weren't admiring the hardwood floors or commenting on the natural light from the bay window. They were scanning, assessing, calculating. The house tour continued in this uncomfortable silence until we reached the second bedroom, which I'd set up as a home office. Dad stopped in the doorway, finally turning to face me directly. "How could you afford this?" he demanded. The question wasn't asked with curiosity or pride, it was an accusation. "I've been saving for years," I answered truthfully, "and I got a conventional mortgage." "Years," Mom repeated, her voice rising. "You've been planning this for years without telling us." I nodded, trying to maintain my composure. "I wanted to do this independently." That's when the dam broke. Mom's eyes filled with tears, not happy ones. "After everything we've done for you," she said, her voice trembling, "all the sacrifices we made, all the financial guidance we provided, and this is how you repay us, with deception. I wasn't trying to deceive you, I defended myself. I just needed to make this decision on my own." Dad's laugh was humorless. "On your own? With what money exactly? The money you earned while living under our roof for 25 years. The money we helped you save by charging minimal rent. That money belongs to the family investment fund." There it was, the mysterious family fund, suddenly relevant when they realized I had assets they hadn't controlled. "That's not how it works, Dad," I said, feeling a lifetime of suppressed frustration rising in my chest. "I earned that money. I saved it. This house is the result of my work." "Your work," he scoffed. "Who paid for the education that got you that job? Who taught you financial discipline? Everything you have is because of what we built." The conversation rapidly deteriorated from there. Years of resentment erupted from both sides. I finally voiced what I'd never dared before, how their control had been suffocating, how their financial guidance had really been manipulation, how I'd lived in fear of their disapproval over the smallest purchases. Mom gasped as if I'd slapped her. "How dare you? We only wanted what was best for you. We protected you from making costly mistakes." "You protected me right out of having any confidence in my own decisions," I countered. Dad was pacing now, his face flushed with anger. "This is unacceptable, Holden. Completely unacceptable. We had an understanding about family finances." "No, you had expectations. I never agreed to them as an adult." The lasagna sat forgotten in the oven as 3 decades of dysfunctional family dynamics played out in my new living room. When I refused to acknowledge their claim to my savings or home equity, Dad grabbed his keys. "You'll regret this betrayal," he said, pointing a finger at me. "Mark my words." They stormed out the front door, slamming with enough force to rattle the windows. I stood in my empty house, shaking with adrenaline and emotion, wondering if I'd just lost my family by claiming my independence. The week that followed was a barrage of hostile text messages and voicemails. Mom vacillated between guilt trips. I cried all night, thinking about your ingratitude and attempts at reconciliation. "Let's just sit down and figure this out as a family." Dad was more direct, repeatedly mentioning the significant funds I supposedly owed the family. I tried to maintain boundaries while not completely severing ties, responding politely but firmly that my home purchase was not up for family discussion or approval. This only escalated their responses. On Saturday morning, just 6 days after the disastrous dinner, they showed up unannounced at my door. Dad carried a thick folder under his arm, his expression grimly determined. "We need to talk about this rationally," he said, pushing past me into the house. Mom followed, clutching her purse like a shield. They spread documents across my dining table, handwritten ledgers, old bank statements, and what appeared to be homemade contracts I had no recollection of signing. "This is documentation of the family investment fund," Dad explained, his tone businesslike. "It clearly shows your financial obligations." I scanned the papers in disbelief. There were entries going back to my childhood allowances labeled as advances, birthday money from relatives recorded as loans, even my high school job earnings categorized as family revenue shares. "This is insane," I muttered, pushing the papers away. "I was a child. You can't hold a child to financial contracts." "You're not a child now," Mom countered, "and you've benefited from family resources your entire life." Dad tapped a calculator, showing me a sum that made my blood run cold. This is the current value of what you owe the fund, with very reasonable interest applied. The figure was nearly the value of my down payment. What exactly are you asking for? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We're entitled to partial ownership of this house, Dad stated. 50% would be fair given the family's investment in your success. I laughed, not from humor but from shock. That's never going to happen. Then you leave us no choice, he replied, gathering the papers. We've consulted an attorney. Either you transfer 50% ownership of this property to us by the end of the month, or we'll be forced to take legal action to recover our investment. You're threatening to sue me, your own son, over a house I bought with my own money. Mom had the decency to look uncomfortable, but Dad's resolve was unwavering. It's the principle, Holden. This isn't just about money. It's about family loyalty and honoring commitments. I showed them to the door, maintaining a calm I didn't feel. I think you should leave now, and I think you should reconsider this course of action. The ball is in your court, Dad said as they left. 50% ownership, or we'll see you in court. I spent the weekend in a state of anxious disbelief, consulting online legal forums and trying to determine if their threats held any water. Surely no court would uphold these fabricated family contracts. But the uncertainty was corrosive, tainting the joy of my new home. When I refused to respond to their ultimatum, the certified letter arrived exactly as threatened. My own parents were suing me for partial ownership of my house and financial compensation from the family investment fund. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. Looking at that official summons, my name listed as defendant and theirs as plaintiffs, something broke inside me. This was no longer about money or property. It was about breaking free from a lifetime of control once and for all. The summons felt heavy in my hands, its legal terminology transforming my parents from family into adversaries. I called in sick to work the next day, spending hours researching family financial disputes and property law, tumbling down internet rabbit holes of worst-case scenarios. By afternoon, I realized I needed professional help. A colleague recommended Eliza Simmons, an attorney specializing in family law. She squeezed me in for a late appointment, listening intently, as I explained the bizarre situation, occasionally raising an eyebrow, but never making me feel judged. "Let me see the summons and their documentation," she said when I finished. I passed over copies of everything my parents had shown me. She reviewed them methodically, making occasional notes. "Holden," she finally said, looking up from the papers. "I want to be very clear. Based on what you've shown me, your parents have no legal claim to your house or savings, none whatsoever." The relief that washed over me was so intense I nearly wept. "These homemade contracts wouldn't hold up in any court," she continued. "You were a minor for most of these supposed agreements, and even the adult contracts lack essential legal elements. As for allowance money or living expenses while you were a child, those are called parenting obligations, not loans." Despite her reassurance, she advised taking the case seriously. "They've filed the lawsuit, so we need to respond appropriately. Just because their claim lacks merit doesn't mean we can ignore it." Over the next few days, I worked with Eliza to prepare our defense. Meanwhile, the emotional toll was mounting. Sleep became elusive, my appetite disappeared, and I found myself jumping whenever my phone rang. The house that had represented freedom now felt tainted by conflict. At Eliza's request, I gathered years of bank statements, pay stubs, and tax returns to prove the source of my down payment. While searching through old files, I discovered something disturbing. My parents had kept meticulous records of every cent they'd ever given me, from childhood birthday money to the value of meals eaten at their table after I turned 18. They had been building this case my entire life, just waiting for the moment I asserted independence. The most painful discovery came when Eliza's legal assistant did some background research and found that my parents had used similar tactics before. My sister Natalie, who I'd lost touch with after she moved to California, had apparently faced financial demands when she graduated from college and refused to move back home. No lawsuit had been filed in her case, but the pattern was clear. I reached out to Natalie for the first time in years, leaving an awkward voicemail explaining the situation. She called back the same day. "I've been waiting for this call for 7 years," she said. "No greeting, no preamble. They're finally coming after you too. Our conversation lasted 3 hours. Natalie had experienced the same controlling behaviors, the same financial manipulation, the same family fund threats. When she'd refused to comply with their demands after college, they'd cut her off completely. Now she was thriving as a software engineer in San Francisco, completely independent from our parents. "I'm flying in for your court date," she insisted. "You don't have to face them alone like I did." At work, my performance was suffering. Deadlines slipped as I spent hours on the phone with Eliza or researching family financial disputes. My boss, Mr. Garrison, called me into his office after I missed an important client meeting. "What's going on, Holden? This isn't like you." I hesitated, embarrassed to explain the situation, but ultimately gave him the abbreviated version. His response surprised me. "Take the time you need to handle this," he said. "My parents pulled similar stunts when I was younger. Not to the point of a lawsuit, but I get it. Family financial dynamics can be toxic." His understanding was a lifeline during a dark time. My colleague Rachel stepped up to cover some of my workload, never making me feel indebted for her help. As the court date approached, my parents attempted a new tactic, reaching out to my friends and coworkers to explain their side. Marcus received a long email detailing my supposed financial obligations to the family. 2 colleagues mentioned awkward phone calls from my mother, asking leading questions about my spending habits. This boundary violation pushed me from anxiety into anger. When Lawrence Palmer, my parents' lawyer, contacted Eliza with a generous settlement offer, reducing their demand to 25% ownership, I didn't even consider it. "Tell them we'll see them in court," I instructed Eliza. "No settlement, no negotiation." The night before our scheduled court appearance, I couldn't sleep. The house I'd worked so hard for creaked and settled around me as I paced from room to room, rehearsing what I might say if asked to testify. How had purchasing a home, usually a celebrated milestone, become a battleground? The pre-court meeting at the courthouse was the first time I'd seen my parents since they'd stormed out of my house. They sat with their attorney, Mom clutching a thick binder, Dad with his typical stern expression. They didn't attempt to speak to me directly, but I caught my mother watching me when she thought I wasn't looking. The most surreal moment came when their lawyer presented the evidence they planned to introduce: family photos of birthdays and Christmases now labeled as exhibits, images of happier times weaponized to prove financial claims. A school picture of me missing front teeth, marked with the value of the outfit I was wearing, supposedly a loan from the family fund. My high school graduation photo annotated with the accumulated debt of my education. Seeing my childhood reduced to financial transactions made me physically ill. I excused myself to the restroom, splashing cold water on my face and staring at my reflection. The face looking back seemed older, wearier than it had just weeks before. "They can't take your house," I whispered to myself. "They can't take your freedom." When I returned, Eliza was calmly dismantling their evidence, point by point, explaining to the judge why each item was inadmissible or irrelevant. I sat beside her, drawing strength from her confident competence, wondering how my pursuit of the American dream had led to this sterile courtroom and the destruction of my family. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everyone in an unflattering pallor. Judge Harrison, a woman in her 60s with silver-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense expression, entered precisely at 9 o'clock. Her gaze swept over all of us, lingering momentarily on me, then my parents, as if trying to understand the family dynamics that had led to this moment. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table, both dressed as if attending church. Mom had chosen her pearl necklace, the one reserved for special occasions. Dad wore a tie I'd given him for Father's Day years ago, an irony that wasn't lost on me. After preliminary introductions, my father was called to testify first. He spoke with the measured confidence of someone who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his position. He described the family financial arrangement in detail, how all money earned or received by family members was considered part of a collective resource. How this had been explained to me repeatedly throughout my life, how my recent actions constituted a breach of long-established family trust. "We never intended to be in this courtroom, Your Honor," he said, his voice catching in what seemed like genuine emotion. "We only want what's fair for the family as a whole." Holden benefited from family resources, his entire life resources, that could have gone to other purposes if we'd known he would later refuse to honor his obligations. Mom's testimony was more emotional. She described the sacrifices they'd made for my education, the countless hours spent teaching me financial responsibility, the family meals and vacations, all framed as investments in my future. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke of feeling betrayed by my secrecy. "We just want him to acknowledge the family's contribution to his success," she said, dabbing at her eyes. "Is it so wrong to expect some return on our investment in our son?" That phrase, "return on our investment," hung in the air, revealing more about their perspective than perhaps she intended. Their lawyer presented the meticulously kept ledgers, the childhood contracts, the calculated value of parental support over the years. He showed photos of me using items purchased with family funds and bank statements from my teenage years with withdrawals highlighted as evidence of money I supposedly owed. Judge Harrison listened impassively occasionally, asking clarifying questions that gave no indication of her thoughts on the matter. When it was our turn, Eliza's approach was methodical. She established my employment history, my consistent saving patterns, the mortgage approval process that verified my financial independence. Then she asked me to take the stand. Facing the courtroom from the witness box was intimidating. My parents watched me with expressions that mingled anger, hurt, and something else, perhaps fear that their control was truly slipping away. I described my childhood and young adult years as factually as possible: the restriction of personal ownership, the appropriation of earned money, the emotional manipulation tied to financial decisions. I explained how I'd built credit, saved independently, and purchased the house with no assistance from anyone else. "Did you ever, as an adult, explicitly agree that your parents would have ownership rights to property you purchased independently?" Eliza asked. "No, never," I replied firmly. "I always assumed that earning my own money meant I could make my own decisions about how to use it." Judge Harrison interjected with her own question. "Mr. Wilson, at what point did you become aware of this so-called family financial arrangement as a formal obligation rather than simply parental guidance?" I considered carefully. "In all honesty, Your Honor, it was always presented as how things are done in this family. There was never a moment where I was given a choice to opt in or out as an adult." The judge nodded thoughtfully. The most unexpected testimony came when Natalie took the stand. She had flown in the previous night, and seeing her in the courtroom, the sister I'd barely spoken to in years, sent a wave of emotion through me. She described her own experiences with our parents' financial control, the similar demands made when she established independence, and the eventual estrangement that followed her refusal to comply. "It's a pattern," she explained. "Financial control disguised as family values." During cross-examination, my parents' lawyer attempted to frame Natalie as a resentful daughter who had abandoned family responsibilities. Her calm response was devastating in its simplicity. "I didn't abandon my family. I just refused to be owned by them." The case took an unexpected turn when Eliza introduced evidence we'd discovered during preparation. My parents had remortgaged their home 2 years earlier, taking out a substantial equity line of credit. Further financial records showed several failed investment attempts and mounting credit card debt. Your Honor, Eliza addressed the court. The plaintiff's financial records indicate they began experiencing significant financial difficulties approximately 2 years ago. It appears this lawsuit coincides with their need for capital, suggesting their claim on my client's home equity is motivated not by long-standing family financial principles, but by their own recent financial mismanagement. My parents' reaction was immediate and telling. Dad's face flushed crimson. Mom gasped audibly. Their lawyer leaned over to whisper urgently to them. Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Is this accurate, Mr. Wilson?" she asked my father directly. Dad cleared his throat. "Our personal finances are irrelevant to this case, Your Honor. This is about family obligations and agreements." On the contrary, the judge replied, "If your claim is motivated by your own financial needs rather than the enforcement of legitimate prior agreements, that seems highly relevant." She proceeded to question my parents about their financial situation with increasing directness. Under her pointed inquiry, the truth emerged piece by piece: bad investments in a friend's business, venture market losses, mounting medical bills not fully covered by insurance. I sat in shock as the reality became clear. This wasn't just about control. They genuinely needed money and saw my home equity as the solution. All the talk of family funds and obligations was a means to access capital they desperately required. "So, to be clear," Judge Harrison said, leaning forward, "you expect your adult son to surrender equity in his independently purchased home to cover financial shortfalls resulting from your investment decisions in which he had no input or benefit." Put so bluntly, even my father seemed to recognize how it sounded. "We've supported him his entire life," he insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The final day of the hearing was brief. Judge Harrison delivered her ruling with efficient clarity. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, this court finds no legal basis for the plaintiff's claim on the defendant's property or savings. No enforceable contract exists, no loan documents were properly executed, and no evidence of fraudulent acquisition has been presented. Furthermore, the court finds the plaintiff's claim appears motivated primarily by their own financial difficulties, rather than any legitimate prior agreement." She dismissed the case entirely, adding a stern warning against any further legal action on the same grounds. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Eliza squeezed my arm in quiet celebration while across the aisle my parents sat motionless, the reality of their defeat sinking in. As we gathered our belongings to leave, my parents approached, stopped by their lawyer, who whispered something in their ears, then continued toward me. Dad's face was a mask of cold anger. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You've chosen property over family. Remember that." Mom said nothing, her expression unreadable. "No, Dad," I replied, finding strength I didn't know I possessed. "I chose independence over control. There's a difference." They turned and walked away. In the courthouse hallway, Dad's parting words hung in the air between us. "You're no longer our son." I watched them push through the heavy doors and disappear, wondering if that statement was a punishment or, ironically, the final step in my emancipation. The days following the court victory were strangely empty. I had won the house, was unquestionably mine, the lawsuit dismissed with prejudice. Yet returning to that house felt different than before. Each room echoed with the harsh words exchanged, each corner reminded me of what the victory had cost. The first night I sat on the living room floor with a glass of whiskey, surrounded by the possessions I had carefully chosen, and place now confirmed as truly mine by legal decree. The validation was complete, but hollowness remained where family should have been. Natalie stayed with me for a week after the trial. Having her in the house brought a different energy, the solidarity of shared experience, the comfort of someone who truly understood the complex emotions swirling through me. "I went through this 5 years ago," she told me one evening as we sat on the back porch. "The guilt comes in waves, then the anger, then the relief. Eventually, you reach acceptance." "Does it ever stop hurting?" I asked. "The hurt changes shape," she replied thoughtfully. "It becomes less about them and more about mourning the family relationship you deserved but never had." Natalie's presence was healing. We reconnected over shared memories, not all bad, despite everything, and began rebuilding the sibling relationship that our parents' dynamics had strained. She helped me hang pictures, choose paint colors, and make the house truly mine. When she left to return to California, we promised to visit each other regularly, a new bond forged through shared trauma and recovery. Returning to work brought its own challenges. Though Mr. Garrison had been understanding, I felt behind and disconnected. Rumors about my family drama had circulated, leaving me feeling exposed. My colleague Rachel remained supportive, inviting me to lunch and normalizing the situation. "Families are complicated," she said simply. "Nobody has the perfect one they show on social media." 3 weeks after the court case, I began seeing Dr. Mitchell, a therapist specializing in family trauma. Our sessions focused on dismantling the deeply ingrained beliefs about money, autonomy, and self-worth that my upbringing had installed. "What you experienced was financial abuse," he explained during our second session. "It's less recognized than other forms, but equally damaging to one's sense of self." Those words, financial abuse, gave shape to experiences I'd never fully named. Understanding that my parents' behavior fit a recognized pattern helped me stop questioning whether I'd overreacted or been ungrateful. As summer progressed, I gradually reclaimed joy in homeownership. I planted a small garden, built a fire pit in the backyard, and repainted the kitchen, a sunny yellow that my parents would have deemed impractical. Each decision made solely on my preferences was a small act of reclamation. In August, I hosted a housewarming party, the celebration I'd originally planned before everything unraveled. Friends from work, neighbors, and Marcus all gathered in my backyard for grilled food and drinks. No one mentioned the lawsuit or my parents' absence. Instead, they brought thoughtful gifts, wrote messages in a house blessing book, and filled the space with laughter that began to overwrite the painful memories. The most unexpected connection came from my next-door neighbors, the Thompsons. Mrs. Thompson brought over a houseplant and mentioned that she'd known my parents years ago through a community organization. "They were always so particular," she said delicately. "I'm glad you found your own path." Her subtle acknowledgement that she understood more than she was saying provided a strange comfort. The outside world had seen what I'd thought was only visible from within. The 6-month anniversary of homeownership arrived in November. I had received no contact from my parents since the courthouse. Thanksgiving was approaching, traditionally spent at their house with extended family, who probably had no idea what had transpired. Natalie and I decided to start our own tradition, planning for her to fly in for a siblings-only holiday. Then the unexpected happened. A week before Thanksgiving, I received a card in the mail, not from my parents directly, but from my mother's sister, Aunt Teresa. The card expressed concern about the family rift and mentioned that my parents were struggling with pride but missing their children. Enclosed was a business card for Dr. Collins, a family therapist, with a note suggesting he had helped other families navigate similar conflicts. After discussing it with Natalie and my own therapist, I made a difficult decision. I called Dr. Collins and arranged a mediated session with my parents at his office, neutral territory, where boundaries could be enforced by a professional. The meeting was scheduled for the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Natalie flew in early, and we spent the holiday cooking together in my kitchen, creating new memories untainted by the past. We discussed our expectations for the meeting, not reconciliation necessarily, but perhaps understanding. "I don't need them in my life to be whole," Natalie said, as we washed dishes that evening, "but I'd like them to acknowledge what happened." Walking into Dr. Collins' office that Saturday was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. My parents were already seated when we arrived, both looking older than they had in court just months earlier. Mom had been crying. Dad sat stiffly, his expression guarded. Dr. Collins established ground rules: no interrupting, no financial discussions, focus on feelings rather than accusations. For the first hour, communication was stilted and defensive. Dad relied on phrases like, "We only wanted what was best and you misinterpreted our intentions." Mom alternated between tearful apologies and subtle guilt trips. The breakthrough came when Dr. Collins asked a simple question: "What are you afraid would happen if you didn't control your children's finances?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "Failure," he admitted. "We were afraid they would fail, and it would be our fault for not teaching them properly." That single moment of vulnerability opened a path to genuine conversation. We learned that their own parents had been financially irresponsible, leaving them insecure and determined to create stability at any cost. The control that had suffocated Natalie and me had been their misguided attempt at protection. Understanding their motivations didn't excuse their actions, but it helped me see them as flawed humans rather than deliberate tyrants. By the end of the session, my parents had acknowledged grudgingly but genuinely that their methods had been harmful despite their intentions. "We don't expect immediate forgiveness," Dr. Collins clarified as the session concluded. "Today was about understanding, not reconciliation. That may come with time and continued work." My parents nodded, subdued, but present in a way they hadn't been before. As we prepared to leave, Mom asked hesitantly if she could see photos of my house. It was a small gesture, but significant, an acknowledgement of my independent life. In the months that followed, we established a new kind of relationship, not close but not entirely severed. Occasional phone calls, carefully avoiding financial topics. A birthday card with no strings attached. Small steps toward a relationship based on respect rather than control. The 1-year anniversary of becoming a homeowner arrived in May. I took the day off work to reflect on the journey, not just the purchase itself, but everything that had followed. Sitting in my backyard under the maple tree, I realized how much I had grown beyond the financial independence I'd initially sought. I had learned to set boundaries without guilt. I had reconnected with my sister. I had created a home that was truly a sanctuary. Most importantly, I had broken the cycle of financial control that might otherwise have continued into the next generation. For the first time, I invited my parents to join Natalie and me for a small anniversary dinner. The evening was not without tension, but it was civil, even pleasant at moments. As they prepared to leave, Dad paused in the doorway. "You've done well with the house," he said awkwardly. "The yard looks nice." From him it was monumental praise. That Thanksgiving, 1 year after the first tentative steps toward healing, I hosted dinner in my home. Natalie came, as did Marcus and a few close friends. My parents accepted the invitation with noticeable trepidation, but arrived bearing a homemade pie and making visible efforts to respect my space and choices. As we gathered around my dining room table, the very table where they had once spread their lawsuit documentation, I felt the weight of the journey we had traveled. The relationship was forever changed. Boundaries firmly established, but not destroyed entirely. Independence, I had learned, wasn't just about having my name on a deed or maintaining separate finances. It was about creating a life authentic to my values, establishing healthy boundaries, and recognizing that family connections should empower rather than constrain. The house that had become a battleground had transformed into something more meaningful, a symbol of resilience, a safe harbor of my own creation, and ultimately the catalyst for a painful but necessary transformation of family dynamics that had been dysfunctional for generations. Have you ever had to stand up to family to protect your independence? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the hardest boundaries to set are with the people we love the most. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life experiences. And remember, owning your life sometimes costs more than money, but freedom is worth every penny. Thank you for listening to my journey.